All right, folks, welcome back. We just finished up talking about the containment policy in communism. So today we're going to talk about a couple of specific policies from the United States to begin that overall containment policy. We're going to be talking about the Truman Doctrine. There's some worrying revolutions happening in Europe, and Truman decides we need to get involved. The Marshall Plan with a $sign for the S because we're throwing a whole lot of money at this problem. And then because of some beginning Cold War hostilities, Operation Vittles, which is probably one of the biggest and most complicated bits of logistics the U.S. military has ever done. I'm sure there's military historians out there that would come up with 4 or 5 examples of bigger logistics issues the military has solved in their time, but I don't know. Operation Vittles is a pretty big one. We had to invent entire new math proofs. There's a section that if you end up going to college and taking a college algebra class, there's an entire section of your college algebra class that's going to be dedicated to the math behind Operation Vittles. Now, they might not mention Operation Vittles when you're doing that unit in your college algebra class, but when you get to linear programming, that's what that was. So, and if you're taking a college algebra class, it's sort of dual credit thing, you may have already done that, so, or you might be doing it soon. So the Truman Doctrine. This comes about, President Truman pictured there on the right, because Greece and Turkey are both having these internal communist revolutions. And if you've looked at a map recently, or a globe in this case, Russia here in the orange, big communist Russia, and they also had control over, Poland and all these, Ukraine and Belarus and all these other, countries that used to be part of the USSR, the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. Kind of take all that in, and gosh, Turkey, this purple one right here, that's right next door. And Greece, it's right next door to all these little other Soviet republics. So it seems to Truman that Russia is starting to spread. It's starting to try and expand. And so he asks Congress for $400 million in military aid. Now, these days, that's a very low number for military aid, but back then that was a significant sum to aid the free people of both countries. And Congress eventually accepts. They send money and tanks and supplies to the governments of Greece and Turkey to fight off the communist revolutions in their country. And that, for the most part, succeeds, at least for now. And this is basically how the Cold War is fought. It's why we call it the Cold War. At no point do U.S. and Russian troops go to war with each other. But the communists in Greece and Turkey were getting money and supplies from the Soviet Union, or at least that's what Truman assumed. And so we sent money and supplies to the not communists. And that's pretty much how it goes. Our tanks and our guns and our bullets would be in the hands, in this case, in the hands of Greeks and Turkish soldiers, and the guns and ammunition and other weapons from Russia would be in the hands of those, Greek and Turkish communist revolutionaries. And so we would let these groups fight using our guns and ammo and supplies and stuff. But we wouldn't ever quite get into a fight with the Soviet Union. And that's how the Cold War is fought. That happens in Korea, that happens in Vietnam, that happens in a whole lot of other countries than just those two. But those are the big ones that we kind of get involved in a bit deeper than the other countries we kind of support. Now, the other half, so that was the sort of direct military aid to help sort of contain communism to its current borders. We also do some non-military bits of help. This is the Marshall Plan, and generally like to put a $ on the S of the Marshall Plan because it's all about that money, right? And here is sort of a political cartoon from the time that sort of shows the struggle, right? So you have Europe climbing a mountain. That Marshall Plan, we're not going down there and like doing things for them. We're just lowering a rope so that they can do the hard work of climbing back out of how bad things were after World War II. And below them, you see these sort of, parapets coming up, those little dome-like structures. That was a very common feature in Russian architecture at the time. So honestly, a lot of that's still around Russia. Like, it's pretty Eastern European Russian architecture kind of thing. Eastern Orthodox churches generally have roofs like that out there. And so, this represents, America with the Marshall Plan, because they helpfully labeled the rope the Marshall Plan, helping Europe dig itself out, or climb itself out in this case, of the problems of World War II. And if they fall down, or if they end up at the bottom of that, they're going to end up in Russia, or at least Russia's going to be the one helping them. So, factories had been bombed. There weren't jobs to go to. There weren't factories to build things in. Things are in a pretty bad state. We'll take a look at just how bad in class. And there's a huge number of unemployed folks running around. And if we learned one thing from the fascist uprisings in Italy and Germany before World War II, it's that huge unemployment numbers can be dangerous. If people can't provide for their families, they're going to find a way to do it, even if that's a less than peaceful way or less than legal way to do it. So Secretary of State George Marshall, President Truman's Secretary of State, comes up with what ends up being called the Marshall Plan. The U.S. is just going to throw money at Western Europe to help them rebuild. So the two effects that the reason America was happy to throw this free money at Europe, because Europe never had to pay us back for it, but we were getting a benefit for our money. And the two big benefits that we were getting was, one, it stopped these Western European countries from turning to communism. We did not offer this money to communist countries. So if there were, communist revolutionaries in France wanting to take over the country, or at least, start a revolution and turn France, into a communist sort of country, they would run into a recruitment problem, because all these people that are getting jobs and their factories are getting rebuilt from this U.S. money would go, well, if we do that, the U.S. isn't going to give us this money anymore. So that was kind of the deal with these Western European countries. We'll keep giving you money to rebuild if you don't go communist on us. And the second thing is that it opened up new markets for American products and goods, because none of our factories got bombed or destroyed. And we were making more things, and we'll talk about this, I think in 8.3. Yeah, 8.3. We'll talk about how much stuff we were making and how much money we had, and how we were making too many things to sell in America, so we needed to find other places to sell them. Well, gosh, if the Europeans have jobs and money, that means they can buy American products. So that's the two things we get out of this free money we're sending to Europe. We are gaining a big share of our influence over these countries to make sure that they don't join up with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and stay on our side. So Operation Vittles, the Berlin Airlift, 1948. The USSR blocks off West Berlin from the US and UK. We talked about yesterday how Germany was split into the 4 different territories. The three Western countries, America, France, and England, had a big chunk of Germany, but Russia had that East Germany chunk. And in that East Germany chunk was the city of Berlin, which we had split off into the 4, like we had the rest of the country. And so there was American, English, and French territory in Berlin, and there was also Russian territory in Berlin and all around the city of Berlin. So Russia is wanting to get all of the city of Berlin, And they figure if we go in shooting, well, that's going to start a war. And technically, we'll have been the ones to start it, and the Americans will show up to defend, and they'll probably be able to get the French and the British, and they might be able to get other countries involved too. Which, it's not guaranteed that Russia would lose that war, but it'd be a pretty rough war. So Russia doesn't want to start a war, so they kind of go old school, and they lay siege to the city. They surround the city. They don't let trucks in and out. So the Western powers, England, US, France, can't resupply the city of Berlin without going through a bunch of tanks. Well, if we take our tanks into Eastern Germany and start trying to blow up their tanks, well, then we started the war. And then Russia could use that to get allies, and we might have a harder time getting allies that way. We'd probably have France and England, but harder to get other allies on top of that, if we're the ones that started it. So the US and UK team up, and we're going to do Operation Vittles, which is almost a year-long airdrop of food and supplies into Western Berlin by airplane. So we send in these repurposed bombers, basically, repurposed, war planes to drop supplies, food, medicine, clothing, basically anything you would need to live a decent life in a sort of capitalist economy and society. So we keep that up, and Stalin thinks, well, they can't keep this up forever, so we'll just let them waste all this money on aircraft and fuel and pilots and everything else, and eventually they'll stop and we'll be able to get Berlin. But after almost a year, Stalin's like, okay, they're never going to run out of money, basically. So this is just making us look bad. We're not winning here. Let's go ahead and stop this. So Stalin takes away the roadblocks. We're able to stop the airlifts, and we're able to get our trucks back in, which is a lot cheaper and more efficient way of doing it. And then the whole math thing behind that, they had to figure out the most efficient way, because it cost a lot of money to do this airlift. So they had to figure out the most efficient way to get the most food and supplies into West Berlin. And the way they did that was a mathematical thing that a mathematical sort of proof that they come up with called linear programming, which uses lines on a graph to determine the most efficient way to do stuff, which is fascinating if you're into math. So if you're not in a college algebra class yet and you want to kind of look up and see what this looks like, well, come to class. We'll take a look at it. Or just Google linear programming, from a college algebra textbook. It'll go over it. And Truman handles this crisis without firing a single bullet, without killing a single person, just spending a lot of money, and Americans loved him for it. He kept us out of a war. He supported our allies. He did everything he had to do without losing anything to the Soviets. So he gets reelected in large part because of his masterful handling of the Berlin airlift. And shortly thereafter, after his reelection in 1948, President Truman helps put together, he's not the only one that did it. This isn't Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, right? President Truman puts together an alliance with Canada and a bunch of the non-communist European countries that are around, so like England, France, are the two big ones, and then a bunch of the other ones around. I think Greece ends up in it, Turkey's in it. I don't know if they're in it originally, but they are in it now. So eventually they end up in NATO. And that becomes the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And its basic idea, it's got a lot of different things in it, but the number one reason it exists is that if any of the countries in NATO ever get attacked, then all of the countries in NATO are going to show up to fight. And it's a very public alliance, right? So before World War I, remember those crazy secret alliance charts we had to look over before World War I? This is kind of like that, but it's out in the open. The U.S. is broadcasting this to the world. If you invade Turkey, we're going to show up and defend Turkey. If you invade Belgium, we're going to show up and defend Belgium. If you invade England or France or any of the countries on this list, we're going to show up and help them. And in the entire history of NATO, spoiler alert, that's only ever happened once. and that was on September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers were attacked by, those terrorists, and the other countries in NATO showed up. So, good organization, good idea. People having each other's backs. Now, the USSR sees this and goes, well, we can't be in it because we're the reason NATO exists, so we're going to make our own NATO. This one with communist countries. And so they did. They called it the Warsaw Pact, and it was basically the same thing on their side of Europe. So if any European country was to invade any other European country, World War III. This time probably with nukes. So the good news is that doesn't really happen. Not officially, anyway. So, 1949, not too long after the whole NATO Warsaw Pact thing, the Soviet Union detonates their first atomic bomb. Not because they had done one from scratch. They had sent in spies and successfully stolen U.S. nuclear secrets, which we'll be talking about later in the unit. The Rosenbergs are the two biggest, most famous spies that get caught doing this, but there's others. And this does start a nuclear arms race between the two superpowers that doesn't end until 1991, when the Soviet Union officially falls apart and goes back to being Russia. And so you can see the number of nukes from both, so all the way till 1949, everything's super under control. And then Russia gets a few nukes, so we get more nukes. And then Russia starts getting more nukes, so we get even more nukes. And it goes back and forth. And we'll talk more about that as we go, because it's going to keep coming back up. So that's it for Notes 8.1. And next time on U.S. history, the Cold War heats up. There's a successful communist revolution in China that shakes NATO to its core. And General MacArthur wants to nuke the Korean Peninsula. And then France is going to need our help to maintain control of Vietnam. So all that and more next time on U.S. history.